The proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Sir Michael Ellis to move the motion.
Well, thank you very much. And I beg to move that this House has considered the government's role in upholding the impartiality of BBC News coverage. And it's an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Bardell, and I refer the Chamber at once to my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interests. And I'm very grateful to have secured the time for this important debate today. The BBC is a much treasured national institution. Its news service is relied upon by millions of British people and others around the world. Impartiality is rightly the foundation stone of the BBC's operational guidelines and the very reason it has garnered the trust of its users over many years. Its journalists provide an invaluable public service, often in trying and sometimes even in dangerous circumstances. It is with great regret, though, that I have concluded that the BBC's impartiality has been brought into disrepute. The BBC has found itself at the centre of ever-increasing controversy in recent years, and it is the organisation's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war which has led it to comprehensively fail the British public. The tragic event, if I may, I'll just make a little progress and then I will give way. The tragic events in Israel and Gaza undoubtedly pose a challenge to any media outlet, given the strength of feelings that it elicits. But a careful review of BBC output shows a clear failure to uphold its obligation to impartiality. And in doing so, BBC News' broadcasting and online content has actively inflamed community tensions here in the United Kingdom, fueled the appalling rise in anti-Semitism, and in one particularly shocking case at least, harmed diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the violence.
I'll give way. Right, I'm refraining from giving way. And before we move on to the in-depth part of his speech, I just wanted to ask my right honourable friend, is not one of the problems with the BBC that it lays down rules and then just ignores them? So, for example, what Gary Lineker wants to say is up to Gary Lineker, but if the BBC say you don't have the right to do that, when he then does it and wags two fingers, does that not completely undermine the BBC's editorial content?
Yes, he's absolutely right, and that is a fundamental, systemic and systematic problem with the BBC, their failure to adhere to standards and deal with these problems when they arise, and I'll be coming to that. The examples, I'll give way to the young gentleman.
I apologise to you, Madam Chair, and to the Honourable Gentleman as well. Right Honourable Gentleman, for not being able to be here. I will meet with the FCDO Minister, but the Honourable Member, Right Honourable Member, is right to set out the case in relation to Israel and Hamas. Also, if you look at the BBC's bias against Brexit, if you look at the bias against Northern Ireland, they can't even name us the right country. Indeed, what they say they call us is their correspondent is the Ireland correspondent. My goodness me, how long is it going to be before the BBC understand that when the Welsh correspondents are called Welsh correspondents, the Scottish correspondents are called Scottish correspondents? See the people from Northern Ireland? They're Northern Ireland correspondents, part of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland. That's who we are. The quicker they catch on, the better.
Sir Michael Ellis.
I think he makes a good point. And the examples of biased content are great in number, and I simply don't have the time to document all of them. But I will share a sample in a moment, and I will give way first, and then I'll share the sample.
Lisa Villiers.
One of the most worrying examples of biased content on the BBC was their coverage of the bombing of the Al-Ahli hospital, where their rush to accept the Hamas allegation that this was caused by Israel genuinely created problems on the ground, made it harder to resolve things. It had a real-life impact. And so it's an example of how the BBC need to be much more careful in their coverage of Israel.
My
Michael Ellis.
my right honourable friend makes a good point, and I shall come to that in more detail momentarily. First, BBC News has been roundly and deservedly ridiculed for its abject failure to identify Hamas as a terrorist group. Under immense pressure, of course, the BBC eventually chose to acknowledge that the group is proscribed in the United Kingdom in its ongoing coverage, but it still today refuses to explicitly label it as a terror group. And its double standard was clear for all to see just weeks after Hamas's heinous pogrom of the 7th of October, when the BBC News website spoke immediately of a terror attack in Brussels linked to Daesh. So not only is the BBC failing to uphold the law of this country when it refers to Hamas as anything other than a terror group, but it effectively becomes complicit in Hamas's well-orchestrated disinformation campaign. And the most dangerous example of disseminating disinformation in the current conflict came on the 17th of October, as my right honourable friend said, when the BBC inaccurately reported that Israel was responsible for an explosion in the Al-Ahli hospital. And BBC News's breaking news Twitter account hurriedly notified its 51 million followers, quote, hundreds feared dead or injured in Israeli airstrike on hospital in Gaza, comma, Palestinian officials say, end quote. BBC News's international editor Jeremy Bowen told television audiences that, quote, hundreds had been killed and, quote, thousands injured after the hospital was, quote, destroyed in what he described as the attack. Terminology which would clearly lead viewers towards the wrong impression that Israel was responsible. And of course there was an urgent Israeli investigation, subsequently independently confirmed from non-Israeli sources, revealing that the incident was caused, in fact, by a misfired terrorist rocket, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And yet, the BBC News website saw fit to present claims and counterclaims, even then, as if there was some sort of moral equivalence between a democratic state whose leaders are elected by their people and whose courts deal with their government, and a genocidal terrorist group that oppresses its people and murders children and innocent civilians. So the incident, I will in a moment if I may, but that particular incident had profound real-world implications. It led to the cancellation of a head of state level regional peace summit. Violent protests erupted across the Middle East, and the World Jewish Congress said it contributed to a spike in anti-Semitism globally, including the burning of synagogues in Tunisia and Germany. That was the repercussion over that one misreport. Reasonable people, Chair, accept that mistakes can be made in any profession, but it's the dismissive nature of the BBC's response to the Al-Ahli coverage debacle and the continuing pattern of troubling output since then that does not reassure that lessons have been learned. And disgracefully, when Jeremy Bowen was interviewed about the incident, he dismissively said he did not, quote, regret one thing, and, quote, I don't feel particularly bothered about that, end quote. So Bowen seemingly downplayed Israel's discovery of evidence confirming Hamas's military operations, including guns, within Gaza's Shifa hospital. He said it was, quote, not convincing. Perversely, though, he said, quote, wherever you go in the Middle East, you see an awful lot of Kalashnikovs. It's not inconceivable that, I don't know, perhaps the security department of the hospital might have had them, end quote. But troublingly, Ms. Bardell, repeated preparedness by the BBC to disseminate unverified claims provided by a proscribed terrorist group with a track record of disinformation should trouble us all. I'll give way.
For giving way, much appreciated. He's making a great speech detailing some of the failures of BBC editorial policy. However, it's not just the BBC that don't prescribe Hamas as a terrorist organisation, it's also other public service broadcasters, such as ITV and Channel 4 as well. And also, I do think as politicians we have to be a bit careful about asking broadcasters to bow to our whim as members of Parliament when it comes to prescribing things and making editorial decisions. As a former BBC journalist myself, I think that there's a real need to balance this with editorial justification and impartiality as well. I'm sure he'll come on to that in his speech. But it's important to recognise that other public service broadcasters also do not prescribe Hamas as a terrorist organisation.
Before the right honourable gentleman continues, I would just like to remind members that interventions should be short and brief. Thank you very much. Sir Michael Ellis.
What we want, need and expect from the BBC is a lack of bias and a proper impartiality, and that's all anyone respects, and they are supposed to be leaders in their field and set an example to other and smaller broadcasters. So I make no apology for expecting high standards from the BBC. I'll give way.
Thank you. In relation to the point my honourable friend has just made, is it not the case, though, that when we have a criminal case in this country, the BBC describes those people in those criminal cases as murderers, as burglars, or whatever else it is that they are? We have a legal framework in this country which has legally determined that this is a terror organisation, and the BBC should apply the same rule in that situation.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Absolutely right. And of course, as the example I gave indicated, they do that for Daesh, another terrorist organisation. They won't do it for Hamas, and of course, that's because of a link with Israel. And of course, not all examples are as flagrant. The bias of BBC News and its journalists can actually be seen in other ways, which shows the depth of the problem. So the BBC follows Hamas's cynical policy of not distinguishing between civilian and combatant casualties. BBC News reports routinely add what amounts to disclaimers on information released by Israel or the Israeli army as being unverified. But time and again, that same rule is not applied to information released by Hamas. And it was only after another pressure campaign that the BBC even started informing viewers that casualty figures from Gaza were actually provided by terrorist-controlled Hamas health ministry. And yet, this seldom comes with a disclaimer about how this is unverified by the BBC. Take, for example, a story on BBC News' website just on the 2nd of February this year, in which it reports, quote, more than 26,750 Palestinians have been killed and at least 65,000 injured, according to health officials in the Gaza Strip, end quote. But it then states, quote, Israeli officials say that 9,000 of those killed were Hamas militants, but have not provided evidence for that figure, end quote. So Hamas has subsequently said, by the way, that it had lost 6,000 fighters, still half of what Israel has claimed. But the BBC has chosen to ignore that Hamas statement, unlike many other news outlets. And this happens daily. So each time, the message it conveys to readers or viewers or listeners is that Israel is not to be trusted over the word of a proscribed terror group who is known to wage information war. And I'll give way.
On the broader question of the Charter itself, a Royal Charter confers a privilege, effectively a kind of monopoly. Does my right honourable friend agree that the licence fee payer, who come from all over the country, are themselves paying for disinformation on the basis of what my right honourable friend is saying, and that, if it were a product liability issue, would lead to all kinds of legal consequences?
Sir Michael Ellis.
That's a very good point, and of course, it puts the BBC in that elevated status, and the taxpayer is obliged to pay for them, and there are consequences from their poor leadership in this area. The BBC's coverage of weekly pro-Palestinian marches has displayed an extraordinary disconnect from reality. They have repeatedly stressed that they are, quote, mostly peaceful, end quote, and yet television reports have featured BBC journalists amidst crowds chanting genocidal refrains and brandishing flagrantly anti-Semitic placards. And not all viewers will have an understanding of these deplorable scenes, and it is incumbent on the BBC to responsibly cover them. On the 30th of October, the BBC posted a news item on its news app headlined, quote, Met Police Chief wants clarity on extremism, end quote. The article actually concerned the appalling displays of anti-Semitism and violent rhetoric at these pro-Palestinian rallies. But strangely, the BBC saw fit to use a photograph of an Israeli flag as the banner image accompanying the piece. So the message this would send to the casual reader is unmistakable. Israel or pro-Israel individuals are the extremists. And BBC Arabic, I'd like now to touch on BBC Arabic. This has repeatedly presented former PLO Major General Wassef Erekat, who has celebrated the, quote, heroic military miracle of the 7th of October, as an independent military expert. Erekat has appeared on BBC Arabic at least 12 times since the 7th of October, despite having admitted to firing artillery shells on what he calls Zionist positions from Lebanon, and making outrageous remarks that Hamas does not target civilians. But concerns over bias within from the BBC are perhaps unsurprising when one considers some of the employment controversies engulfing the organisation, and I'd like to touch on those now. A scheduling coordinator for BBC Three, Dawn Quaver, branded Jewish people, quote, Nazi apartheid parasites, end quote, and referred to the Holocaust as the HoC. In the wake of the 7th of October, BBC News Arabic journalists likened Hamas to freedom fighters and spoke of a morning of hope. A Beirut-based correspondent on BBC Arabic, Sana Khoury, tweeted that Israel's prestige is crying in the corner and liked to comment about receiving sweets that were distributed in celebration of Hamas's attack. And we've heard about Gary Lineker, and he encapsulates the problem within the BBC. Lineker has shared a video with 8.9 million of his followers with the offensive accusation that Israel is committing genocide and mourning the death of a Palestinian footballer who was later revealed to be a quote, martyr fighter for Hamas. He also shared a message calling for Israel to be banned from international football tournaments. And Lineker has frankly made a mockery of new social media guidelines which had been drawn up following an earlier controversy over his politicised posts. And amidst this sorry state of affairs, it is perhaps unsurprising, though no less distressing, that the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, recently acknowledged anti-Semitism was within the corporation. Perhaps that's not surprising, Madam Chair, when the Apprentice star we've heard about recently tweeted that Zionists were odiously ogre-like. And yet the BBC Compliance Department apparently ruled that that was not anti-Semitic. Instead, they sent him on a diversity course. If Zionism was just a policy, by the way, and not a euphemism for Jews, which we all know it is, how can someone who supports a policy of any sort be physically ugly? It gives the lie to the whole charade. What they are really talking about when they say Zionists is, of course, Jews. And shamefully, BBC employees were prohibited from attending a major march against anti-Semitism last year on the spurious grounds that it was controversial. And compounding this, BBC News saw fit to describe that as a pro-Jewish march. So the BBC has been criticised by Ofcom for its coverage, as many will recall, of a vile anti-Semitic attack on Jewish students in London in December 2021, finding that it had failed to observe its editorial guidelines on due impartiality and due accuracy. Of course, in that episode, the BBC had falsely accused Jewish victims of making anti-Muslim slurs. This was swiftly disproven. However, the BBC failed to update its online news article for nearly 2 months, with no regard for the well-being of the attack victims and the wider Jewish community. So simply, there have been too many examples of a lack of impartiality for the BBC to keep dismissing concerns. The BBC's biased coverage throughout this conflict has undoubtedly had an impact on the public's perception and the understanding of it, and has steered it in a more anti-Israel direction. And the consequences, I will give way. Yeah.
Quick question. I'm just wondering what response he's had from the BBC when he's raised these concerns in order, are they taking action?
Well,
Michael Ellis.
I'll be coming to that, but of course, we know that the BBC have received a myriad amount of complaints. The consequences of its lack of impartiality have been particularly acute for the UK's Jewish community. Just as the Al-Ahli misreporting led to a violent spike in anti-Semitism across the world, so too has the relentless bias of BBC News coverage contributed to the record levels of intimidation and attacks on British Jews. It's interesting to note that more than 3/4 of Jews in Britain, 77%, when interviewed by Survation for a newspaper recently, believe BBC coverage of the war in Gaza is biased against Israel. And dozens of current Jewish employees at the BBC are understood to have filed formal complaints about their concerns over anti-Semitism, describing it as grim and a frightening time to be Jewish at the corporation. The BBC's senior management has fundamentally failed to deal with this problem and uphold its own guidelines, and the organisation now appears complicit in peddling misinformation and allowing anti-Semitism to fester. And in those circumstances, I have come to the conclusion that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic. And 20 years since the Balin report into the BBC's anti-Israel bias, the organisation, by the way, has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds from hard-working licence fee payers' money to suppress that report, a 20-year-old report. And so I would ask the Minister, my honourable friend, to join me in adding her voice to the calls for the BBC to finally publish that report. I wrote to the Director General before Christmas, and he declined to release it. And I'd like to ask the Minister also whether she would agree with me that the time has come to finally say that the BBC's ability to mark its own homework must be removed. Existing complaints procedures are ineffective and they do not command confidence. And I'd like to end by recounting the words of 22-year-old Noah Abrahams, who left his dream job at the BBC after their refusal to unequivocally call Hamas what it is, a terrorist organisation. Noah, who is, as I say, 22, said that, quote, words have the power to fuel hate. They have the power to put fuel on the fire. They impact how we think, how we react, and how we act. They have influence. And I challenge all of us here to stand up for truth, challenge the BBC in its deeply entrenched bias, and call for accountability.
I do remind members that look to be called to Bob, and I will hope to call front benches by 28 past, so I'll just be asking those who are speaking to be mindful of that. The question is that this House has considered the government's role in upholding the impartiality of BBC News coverage. I now call Gregory Campbell.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on securing this debate. I want to start, as indeed he did, by quoting what anyone can get if they go on Google and ascertain the BBC's main contribution to wider society, and it is the BBC is the world's leading public service broadcaster. We are impartial and independent, and every day we create distinctive world-class programmes and content which inform, educate and entertain millions of people in the UK and around the world. That indeed was the case many years ago, and I, for one, would hope that the BBC could salvage something of their reputation to return to that high-sounding statement of what they set themselves up to be. I want initially, Ms Burdell, to refer, and I know my right honourable friend alluded to the high-profile on-screen talent, as they are called, the most expensive paid employee in the BBC, and that is Gary multi-millionaire Lefty Lineker. And Mr Lineker was taken to task whenever he made his initial contribution, which it was felt breached guidelines, and the BBC agreed that they did indeed breach the guidelines that both he and others were expected to adhere to. But within a few hours, some of Mr Lineker's on-screen friends, some of whom were in his employ, decided to down tools, and they walked out. And we had one edition of Match of the Day without Gary Lineker in situ. And of course, then the Director General of the BBC caved in. Instead of saying to both Mr. Lineker and those who were with him, there's the door. If you don't like the guidelines, off you go and get jobs elsewhere. That's what the Director General should have said and didn't. But he caved in. And Mr. Lineker returned, smirking at his ability to thumb his nose at the guidelines. So then the BBC revised the guidelines. And they were asked, including Mr. Tim Davie, if he says again under the guise of the new guidelines, what he said was in breach of the old guidelines, is he in breach of the new ones? And the Director General couldn't really answer the question. So I don't know whether Mr. Lineker decided to test the water again, but off he went again, and my right honourable friend alluded to what he said the next time. And of course, no action was taken. Unfortunately, Ms. Bardell, this is an example, just a blatant example, of the way the BBC seem to be prepared to, whatever the woke agenda is, whatever the leftist agenda is, it's taken as something that they must endorse, or if there's a breach of some guidelines, they turn a blind eye to it. Yes, I will, yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving away. He's making a very good point about high-paid staff at the BBC. Does he agree that fundamentally, whether you're a staff member or a star, the social media guidelines people working at the BBC should be exactly the same?
Gregory Campbell.
Well, I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and yes, I do, and the penalty should be the same as well. That should go without saying, but unfortunately we have to say it. The other issue, Ms. Mardell, that I wish to turn to is the comprehensive analysis by my right honourable friend about Hamas and Israel has been gone into with some in-depth knowledge, and I don't wish to add to that other than to agree with it. And I watched aghast at some of the breaches, whether it was Jeremy Bowen or the BBC Arabic journalists, but the whole plethora of issues that he raised. But I want to come to another issue, Ms. Bardell, and that is that there are some programmes in the BBC that are excellent investigative analysis programmes, like Panorama, like BBC Northern Ireland Spotlight programme, and they do, from time to time, do very comprehensive, in-depth investigations into issues that are in the public interest. And that's exactly what they should do. And they are to be commended when they do that. But, for example, over a period of years, there has been a huge public interest issue, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the UK, to the whole matter of this concept that I have consistently ridiculed, because I have personal experience of it, of the hard border on the island of Ireland. There could have been a panorama or a spotlight investigation to show how ludicrous that is, how porous the border is, that it was nonsense to be bullied by the EU to agree to some sort of regime about trading between the UK and the EU because of the threat of a hard border when it could not materialise, because there were 280 physical crossing points on a land border that only stretches for 300 miles. It would take a military force of some 100,000 personnel to man it. And we had 30,000 personnel when there was a murder campaign, and they couldn't create a hard border. But no spotlight investigation, no panorama investigation into the concept of a hard border. Similarly so, at the moment, we have a trading issue which hopefully is being resolved between Northern Ireland and GB. We could have an investigative programme into the problems that some people have trying to get plants and seeds from GB into Northern Ireland. A simple reporter with a photographer, a cameraman and a sound person going on the ferry from Belfast to Stranraer, acquiring a few plants and seeds, putting them in the car and driving back to the ferry and returning back to Northern Ireland with no problem to the EU single market. and yet the EU demands certain regulations, which we hope are being resolved, but no investigation by the BBC, and they could and should be doing such. Another issue that is coming up, Ms Bardell, and with this I conclude, there is a BBC 4 programme to be broadcast this weekend. And while I will reserve complete judgment until I watch it, I think it's called Shooting the Rapids, and it's to go out on BBC 4 this weekend. And the former Director General, I think it was, of the BBC, described the British public not being told the truth about the Troubles in the 1960s and 1970s in Northern Ireland because, and I quote and apologise for the language, the bloody Protestants were running the BBC in Northern Ireland. Now, I don't know where he has been for the last 30 or 40 years, but he needs to come back and check who's running the BBC in Northern Ireland now. Martin Bell on the BBC, Dennis Toohey for the BBC, said that the BBC was prevented from telling the British public about discrimination against Catholics in education, work and housing. This is all to go out on the BBC this weekend on BBC 4. And if they had come to me or some people I would have recommended they would speak to about disadvantage in education, work and housing, they would have seen it's not the people that they think are being disadvantaged, but it's many Protestants who are currently being disadvantaged in those very sectors. So here are programmes, Ms Bardell, and I just hope that the Minister will take on board these issues. I don't expect her to respond to each and every assertion about individual programmes, but there is an Ofcom responsibility, and there is a responsibility by government, particularly regarding the recent mid-term review, to say to the BBC, there have been this whole series, this plethora of assertions and allegations made against BBC coverage and partiality and partisanship in terms of news reporting.
Member, give way.
Yes, I will. Yeah.
Thank my colleague for giving way and doing so. There is very much an imbalance within the BBC in relation to those in frontline reporting being from one section of the community or another. And the difficulty that we have, there seems to be a hidden agenda which is driving not only what happens in Northern Ireland, but what happens in this House. And what is deemed to be important is made important by the media, not necessarily by the general public, but what the media want to portray as the most important thing to focus on.
Before the member responds, I'm sure we're all looking forward to his peroration so that we can make sure that everybody gets a good shot, a crack at the whip.
Thank you, Ms Bardell. Thank you, and I will be bringing my remarks to a close. I do agree with my honourable friend, and these issues have to be investigated. Hopefully the Minister, who I know takes a deep interest in these issues, will be able to raise it with the Director General, and we can see not words, not promises, not new guidelines, but some action from the BBC, both nationally and in the regions. Thank you.
Call Steve Double. I am going to impose a formal time limit of 4 minutes to allow interventions and to make sure everybody can get in. Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Ms Bardell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I congratulate my right honourable friend for securing this very important debate and thought he made an excellent opening speech. And as I've only got a few minutes, I won't cover much of the ground that he covered, but I thought he made a number of very great points and cited a number of very specific cases where the BBC are clearly failing in their responsibility to be impartial, particularly in regard to the reporting of the events in Israel and Gaza. The fact is the BBC enjoy a very privileged position within our country, and particularly within the broadcast media, being funded by the licence fee, effectively publicly funded, and as such I believe we have a right to expect them to uphold higher standards than anyone else. I know comments were made with regard to other broadcasters, but I think the fact is that we expect the BBC to set the standard and provide leadership that others will hopefully follow. And I believe that they have failed to do that in recent months, sadly. with regard to Israel and Gaza. The number of incidents that my right honourable friend quoted, but if I just highlight one, particularly the case of the rocket that hit that hospital. And it just felt like the BBC couldn't wait to jump to the conclusion that this must have been Israel. Yeah. And they were almost, it felt like, disappointed when it came out that it clearly wasn't, and sort of grudgingly had to admit that they had got their initial reports wrong. And I think that raises a number of very serious concerns about what is going on at the BBC. I sometimes wonder whether it is that they have a blind spot because they are so focused, so blinded by their views about Israel that they can't see how biased they are being in their reporting, or whether they're aware that they're being biased, but they just don't care. And I'm not quite sure which it is, but it has to be one of those two. And I think they do very seriously need to assess what is going on, assess the way that this conflict is being reported on their news broadcast media, because they do have a role in shaping public views. And clearly we've seen the rise in the number of anti-Semitic incidents take place in recent months in this country, and the shameful treatment of a number of our Jewish community across the country. Yeah. And it's very difficult to come to any other conclusion than, sadly, the BBC have contributed to this because of the way they have presented Israel in such a poor light over recent months. Now, I'm not saying Israel are faultless. I'm not saying Israel never get anything wrong. But it just feels like the BBC will report Hamas reports and statistics and numbers without any qualification, without any sense of caution that these are coming, this information is coming from Hamas. And yet when Israel reports something, it's highly qualified, as though this is Israel telling us this, therefore we need to treat this cautiously. And I think that is having an impact on the public's view, on public perception of what is happening, and sadly that is feeding through into what we're seeing on our streets. And I note that to the Minister that in the mid-term release on the BBC in assessing their charter responsibilities, the Secretary of State did lead on the issue and concerns about impartiality in that report. And that does lead me to believe that government perhaps do share many of our concerns about the impartiality of the BBC. And so I would simply ask, in concluding, what further discussions are going on with the BBC to hold them to account to their obligation to be impartial and to fulfil their public service obligation in reporting the news from Gaza and Israel?
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr Dowell. It's a pleasure serving your chairmanship, and I congratulate my right honourable friend for securing this debate. All reporting on this conflict should be done from the starting point of remembering that on one side we have a Jew-hating, gay-hating, misogynistic, terrorist death and rape cult, and on the other we have a democratic, liberal state with strong independent processes, which was attacked on October the 7th. And the fact that 77% of British Jews do not believe that the BBC, just 0.5% of the population, remember, the Jewish population is in this country, do not consider this coverage to be fair, should be taken as a cry of pain from the Jewish community by the BBC, and they should take that very, very seriously. My right honourable friend mentioned the Director General's recent email. I would ask the Minister to follow up with the Director General to say, what is he actually doing then to respond to these examples of anti-Semitism in the BBC? I previously described the BBC in a debate a couple of months ago as Israelophobic. I think the words my right honourable friend has used of them having an institutional problem with anti-Semitism are absolutely true. And that is fuelling not only hate at the Jewish population in this country, the way in which they are presenting this conflict on television is fueling hate at members of Parliament as well. And why do I say that? Well, we've heard, as my honourable friend said, about how they continue to quote casualty figures from Hamas as fact, an organisation that has previously misrepresented casualty figures. Meanwhile, Israeli witnesses to the rape of Israeli women on October the 7th had their story told on the BBC with the added provision that of the words, the BBC has been unable to verify these claims, not applied to Hamas, of course. They have deliberately presented this conflict from the point of view of civilians in Gaza and contrasted that with the Israeli military or with Israeli politicians, including those who are at the most extreme ends of the Israeli government, which all of us on this side would have little to do with, but who at the end of the day also have little impact on the positioning of the Israeli government's policies. The BBC has chose to subject viewers to an anti-Semitic apprentice participant, who even when they became aware of it, they offered him sensitivity treatment. I have written to the BBC numerous times asking them who provided that training and what was the specific content in relation to anti-Semitism, because none of the charities that deal with this and have an expertise in this, such as the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, were involved in that process. They will not tell me. As Hamas perpetrated its massacres on 7th of October, the BBC aired an interview with Rafi Alia, a lecturer at Gaza Islamic University, who described the attacks as resistance and legitimate and moral. A senior BBC broadcast journalist joked about a woman whose grandmother was abducted by Hamas as receiving an inheritance. On Christmas Eve, the BBC reported unverified and false claims that from Hamas that the IDF was carrying out summary executions. They had to apologise for that. And today, we see an example of that with this coverage on civilians in Gaza. There's absolutely no doubt civilians are suffering, of course, but the coverage today that is being provided on the BBC is not something that was given to members of Israeli society or to those victims. I would like to go on, but I'm afraid the speaking time in this debate is so limited, it is impossible to go further. I would just ask the Minister to look at a couple of things in my final few minutes, one of which would be asking them for a full review of how their coverage on this conflict contrasts to others, and to ask whether or not the BBC is planning to offer proper anti-Semitism training within its institution, provided by actual members of the community with expertise in this.
Thank you, Mr. Ballard. I too am concerned about the BBC's persistent failure to fulfil its legal obligation to be impartial. And we also saw this with Brexit. To give an example, Newswatch, which is an independent monitoring organisation run by a former BBC producer, said that on Europe there were twice as many Remainers as pro-Brexit speakers, with an even greater imbalance in terms of the amount of time people had to speak. That was 7 to 3, nearly 9,000 words as against 4,000. So no wonder the political elites of this country were stunned by the results of the referendum. They haven't seen it coming. I'd love to.
The BBC, in their language about Brexit, were not impartial, as illustrated by their persistence in referring to a so-called cliff edge Brexit as a way to describe leaving without a deal with the EU. No one wanted that outcome, but the BBC shouldn't have been portraying it as a potential disaster via the terminology they used.
I wish I'd thought of that for my speech. Thank you. The reality is that the failure to report impartially the multiplicity of viewpoints in the UK is actually driven by... The BBC pride themselves on diversity, don't they? But there's a real lack of diversity of thought in the BBC. There's an intellectual homogeneity that means there's no real balance of opinion amongst its staff. There's no recognition amongst those who make the decisions at the BBC that the recruitment policy, broadening its culture, would better serve the licensed fee payers and better reflect its viewers and the wider country. And today, the stakes seem very much higher, as we've heard in the superb speech just now. Given that they've got these huge resources made available to them via the licence fee, and with the heightened tensions here as a result of the crisis in the Middle East, we thought it really could do a bit better. In 2021, I and colleagues wrote to the PM and I urged him to consider directing Ofcom to deal directly with all impartiality events at the BBC, rather than let the BBC in the first instance do these themselves. Of course, this would need to be accompanied by some changes within Ofcom. To deal impartially and deal with complaints objectively, its contents board needs to change from what it is now, as it seems to be stuffed with former BBC lifers. I also urge ministers to consider requiring the BBC to set up an independent unit to monitor bias on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Call Sir Bill Cash.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would simply like, first of all, to refer to some figures over the last 5 years with respect to the question of complaints made by the licence fee payer, i.e. the taxpayer, who actually 90% actually pays for the BBC. The figures are that audience complaints to the BBC from 2017 to 2023 are 1,935,179, that's nearly 2 million, of which 3,692 only complaints progressed to the BBC's Executive Complaints Unit. Only 147 complaints were upheld on partially or were upheld or partially upheld by this Executive Complaints Unit. And only 4 of the 1,067 complaints which were escalated from that complaints unit to Ofcom were actually decided by Ofcom as being BBC breaches of the Broadcasting Code. So you go from 2 million to 4 upheld breaches decided by Ofcom. That tells us a great deal. The second thing, I mean, anyone with half a brain would realise that the rest of the 2 million complaints that have been made must have contained, and people know from their personal common sense experience, do contain gross breaches of impartiality. And I've been talking about this to ministers for the last several years. Now, the way the midterm review was revealed to the public was, to my great regret, merely a written ministerial statement, which should have been done, in my opinion, by an oral statement on the floor of the House. I hope I've got that right, but that's my understanding. The second thing is that we do need a proper, full debate. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend, right honourable friend, for his raising this issue with particular emphasis on the Hamas-Israel situation. However, the problem does also go very much deeper. And I do say that it's an endemic problem. It's an almost perpetual problem to which there appears to be no answer. There is therefore great importance to be attached to the need to propose or implement an effective and workable regulatory structure between the BBC and Ofcom, and to reform Ofcom's role in the complaints framework. There is an inadequate reform which has been going on of the complaints framework, and in particular the intended role of the BBC board and editorial guidance and standards committee. Despite recognising the inadequacies which the government did of BBC, nonetheless, a failure to initiate, even so, an independent framework for the handling of complaints, and with no reason specified, we need a vital reform to facilitate closer scrutiny of impartiality that has unnecessarily been postponed until the next Charter review in 2027. A major omission of the review is a failure to define impartiality itself. The review actually claims that the task was too complex. I find that astonishing, particularly when one considers that in the Oxford Dictionary, which is pretty standard stuff, it states quite clearly as follows, that impartiality consists of official, the impartiality definition insists that official judgments and reports should be based on objective and relevant criteria without bias or prejudice. All the evidence points in the other direction. The figures I've given are absolutely astonishing, and it's a very, very great failure for us not to have actually managed to get this right. I pay tribute to this minister who is sitting in this room at this moment in time, and other ministers who participated in this process. But I have to say, it hasn't met the degree of performance which we would have hoped for. We were hoping for a midterm review that would actually deal with the issue of impartiality, and I regret to say that it's going to need a bigger debate on the floor of the House of Commons, with the Minister giving a full account and every Member of Parliament having the opportunity across party to get this thing right once and for all.
Alex Shelbrooke.
Bardell. Pleasure to serve in your chairmanship today. And may I say, congratulations to my right honourable friend whose opening speech covered such a wide area of many absolutely vital points, backed up with the evidence that his fine legal mind was always going to bring to this debate. Ms Bardell, can I just say, my Jewish constituents are bloody terrified now. It was bad enough leading up to the 2019 general election when many of them felt they would leave this country, but they had fairly good faith that the Labour Party would not win that election. Now they are truly terrified. I have heard my honourable friend from Brigham Gall say that he feels safer in Israel than he does on the streets of his own country. And that goes to be true for a great number of my constituents who, to make matters worse, are seeing an inbuilt bias within the BBC almost justify those who are launching anti-Semitic attacks against my constituents.
Will you give way?
I will give way to my friend.
He's absolutely right in that, and I didn't get a chance because of our time, but would he look at the coverage today on the BBC, where once again, the picture that is being painted by the BBC is of suffering Gazan civilians, who inevitably are suffering, of course, versus a well-armed Israeli military that is trying to deal with Hamas. There are no images of Hamas fighters, no images of the hostages who are being held. It is this picture of civilians versus the Israeli military, which gives a wholly false impression of the battle that is going on. There's a whole day of it today on the BBC, and all that will do is lead to more threats and more abuse to Jewish people in this country. And of course, nobody has been able to verify any of the information coming out where we know people cannot speak freely because Hamas control the message and control people. And it's appalling, the coverage today.
I am so grateful to my honourable friend, and he brings to this debate a unique perspective on what's actually happening to the Jewish population in this country, more than I could hope to describe at this moment in time. And I think that there are several ways that it just creeps in as to how terrible the Israelis are. For example, especially listening to the radio, you don't necessarily have the pictures. You know, Israel have bombed a refugee camp. Most people believe that a refugee camp is an area full of tents and people who have been displaced and suffering. These are historic refugee camps with concrete buildings and towns that have been built around them. And it's this laziness to go further, to actually describe the situation that adds to these areas. But let me just say, Ms Bardell, that I think the BBC is a very important institution in this country. I think there's always a role for public service broadcasting. But I hear so many of my constituents say they hate the BBC. Now, I would argue that what they hate is BBC News, not the BBC itself. That's right. Yeah. But the reality is that because the BBC's bias is coming through in so many ways, and Gary Lineker can say what he wants, but those who said he couldn't say it and then do nothing about it are doing untold damage to the credibility of the BBC.
Would my honourable friend
I will give way to my
Would my honourable friend like to lay a bet that this particular proceedings will not appear on Today in Parliament tomorrow morning?
Alex Shelbrooke.
It's quite amusing because I was sat here just wondering whether we would actually make Today in Parliament. I think it may get a mention, but will probably be quite well edited. But the reality is this: we live in a world now where people are willing to be more militant. And if the BBC does not grasp this problem and deal with it, then people will stop paying their licence fee and damn the consequences. Because they can, with social media, they can overwhelm, a bit like when the poll tax happened and it basically got dropped because no one was paying it. And that's one of the things which for the BBC. Because you ask people, they listen to BBC radio a lot, they listen to football coverage a lot. A public service broadcaster has an important role in any country. And we must be careful when we're having these debates not to give the impression that we want to abolish the BBC. What we all want is quality, independent, impartial news coverage that allows the public to get the view of what is actually happening in the world. There are plenty of television stations and news stations, especially in the advent of digital television, where you can pander to your opinions if you want to. A public service broadcaster must always be above that. I cast my mind back to when the Home Secretary was being interviewed by Amal Rajan on the Today programme and said, if you're going to carry on making statements at me, I'll go and have a cup of tea. Now, I've never heard that on the Today programme before. I think it's absolutely vital that some of the really most hard-hitting questions should be put to politicians. And we should be able to answer them. And I don't care how bad they are, as long as everybody gets the same toughness of interview and question. But it's not up to journalists to sit there and make statements towards the politician they're interviewing. It's up to them to probe the policies that they're running and where they're at. And if that ends up embarrassing the politician, so be it. But it has to be equal across the board. So I have a great concern that what's actually happening at the BBC is undermining the entire institution. And I asked the Minister of what potential conversation she can have that those who are setting the rules to protect the impartiality of the BBC but are doing absolutely nothing to enforce them can be held to account to make sure that this institution, which I believe is vital across the world and to this country, as long as it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and at the moment it isn't. Thank you, Ms. Butler.
Thank members for their brevity. And we come to the front benches earlier than expected, and the first of those is SNP spokesperson Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for your work in chairing this meeting today. I'd like to also congratulate the member for Northampton North in attaining this debate today. I want to cover a few things, some of which have been covered, some of which haven't so much. It is absolutely the case that public service broadcasting is incredibly important, and that it's incredibly important that the impartiality is measured and the impartiality is there in the broadcasting. It is the case that there have been many UK government decisions that have undermined the impartiality of the BBC, including the Director General being a former Tory candidate, including a personal friend of Boris Johnson being made the chair of the BBC, a Tory donor who donated £400,000 to the party and lent £800,000 to Mr Johnson specifically. So there is an issue with impartiality. There's an issue with being seen to be impartial as well as potentially being impartial. I have a BBC studio in my constituency that does news, that does local news in Aberdeen, but also is involved in some of the big events that happened. For example, when the Queen passed away, they were the first on the scene reporting from there. And I just want to be clear to those people working in my constituency and across the BBC that we're not saying, that nobody in this room, I think, is saying that any of them individually are anti-Semitic, other than perhaps the ones that were mentioned by name. It is not, I don't think, from anyone, an attack on these individuals. And I want to be clear that we value the work that they do, and we value the fact that they do report in sometimes incredibly difficult conditions. It is the case that sometimes reporting is got wrong. From every broadcaster, it is the case that mistakes are made and they need to be as swiftly as possible rectified. I just want to be clear about the BBC's position on what happened in relation to Al Ali Hospital. They say that, contrary to many reports, the BBC did not claim that the Israelis were responsible for the attack. They, along with many other media outlets, reported initial claims by Palestinian officials and eyewitnesses that it was an Israeli airstrike and attributed those claims to those who were making it. And then they sought a response immediately from the IDF, and the Israeli authorities countered the claims, and they prominently and consistently reported the position of the IDF. That is the BBC's position. It may be an idea to watch back some of that coverage in order to see what exactly was said by the journalists at the time. In relation to... Yeah.
Like the Honourable Lady, and I hate to criticise on this, but I think that's not really credible. They reported it, I believe, and I will check this, it went out on push notifications from them. And the fact remains that as a serious public sector broadcaster on an issue as sensitive and as serious as this, they should have done and applied the independent verification to this story, as they demand and require Israel to provide on claims, before they put that out and gave it such prominence. So I don't think their response is really credible in respect to the Honourable Lady.
Blackman.
I just felt that this was the BBC position, and I wanted to be clear because they don't have a voice in this debate right now.
The BBC's breaking news Twitter account, the push notification, 51 million followers, quote, hundreds feared dead or injured in Israeli airstrike on hospital in Gaza, Palestinian officials say.
Kirsty Blackman.
Which is attributed to Palestinian officials on that account. But absolutely, you know, I think it's worth watching it back. I think it's worth, but the BBC position is that they were very clear about it. Just in terms of the bias and the ideas around the bias or the lack of impartiality, apparently 36% of the people in the public see the BBC as neutral. 15% of them see the BBC as pro-Palestine, and 17% see the BBC as pro-Israeli. It is the case that we have had throughout Scotland at BBC studios protests outside suggesting that the BBC is in fact too pro-Israel. These protests have taken place outside a number of BBC studios in Scotland, including Aberdeen, twice. Any of those things are concerning and worrying for staff. It is absolutely the right for people to protest. Any of those protests, whichever direction people are facing in those protests, can be worrying for people who are, you know, perhaps not even anywhere near reporting on either what is happening in Gaza or any other sort of foreign affairs.
Sorry to do this again, but I've had this when I've met with the BBC, and I've had this said to me that, oh, well, look, a lot of people think we're pro-Palestinian, a lot of people think we're pro-Israel. That is irrelevant, frankly, to actually what is the actual coverage. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the perception is. That doesn't mean that there isn't an issue here. And I have so far not found a single example of a BBC journalist who has had to be dealt with, suspended, reported for making pro-Israeli statements on their social media accounts, whereas there are plenty that relate to this kind of. So the fact that that perception doesn't alter the fact that there's an issue here.
I'm just going to respond to that one. Actually, I do think the perception is important, and I think it's really important the point that the Honourable Member made around the 77% of Jewish people in the UK feeling that the BBC is biased. And I wanted to say, having said all of that about the views of the general population, that nonetheless it is incredibly important to listen to the communities who, particularly Jewish people who've got a long history of persecution. It is incredibly important to listen to those views and to understand that if a community feels that the BBC are doing something wrong, that they need to take that incredibly seriously.
She's been generous in giving way. Can I just reiterate the point that, and I'm sure she'll agree with this, that it is very easy for people to make any sort of claim or counterclaim, but there needs to be some evidence. I like to think that in my speech, I gave numerous evidence examples. And if people are going to say there's evidence of BBC pro-Israel bias, they need to be able to cite some examples of that, and I don't think they'll be able to do that.
Kirsty Blackman.
Well, given that I was coming in to talk more generally about the impartiality of BBC News, and I had very little notes on the conflict in Gaza, I'm afraid I do not have, and I'm not here to defend the BBC. I just wanted to be clear what their position was, particularly around that one incident that was mentioned. Just following up in terms of the views of Jewish people across the UK, I did meet with the Union of Jewish Students in the wake of what was happening in the conflict, particularly around what was happening at Aberdeen University and how safe or unsafe they felt on campus. And they did raise concerns with me about reporting. But the concerns that they raised were not specifically around the BBC, it was about reporting in general. And I think it's very important, as I said a moment ago, for us to be listening to those people who are saying we are being discriminated against or there is bias against us. Because me, as a non-Jewish person, I maybe don't feel all the undercurrents or see or hear all of that. And therefore, not just us as parliamentarians, parliamentarians in listening to views, but the BBC itself needs to ensure that when it's doing diversity training, for example, as a member for Briggangool mentioned, that they are listening to members of the community who are the experts in this. And I would absolutely agree with his suggestion that the training should be carried out by those people who are genuine experts, like the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, and I'll declare an interest so members can look at my register of interests in relation to that. Just lastly on this, it is important to think about the regulation of the BBC. We've just had the media bill, which is the first media bill in 20 years. It's been a long time between regulation from public service broadcasting in general. However, BBC is negotiated through the Charter and the agreement that comes alongside it. It is in some ways removed from Parliament to be able to take action on some of this. It is more in the remit of the UK government to be able to take some of these actions. I would advise the Minister, or ask the Minister, that when she's looking at this, she does look at some of the genuinely good work the BBC have done around increasing diversity. I've sat down and spoken to them about this in recent times, but also that she makes an assessment of whether the training, the 10-point plan that they've put in place, whether the impartiality training and diversity training that they have put in, whether she feels that they are sufficient, whether the government feels that they are sufficient, and whether the communities who are impacted feel that they are sufficient, in order that the BBC can be impartial, can continue to be respected, and can provide that public service broadcast that so many people rely on in order to get their news.
Cool. Labour Opposition Spokesperson, Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Ms Bardell, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I'd like to begin by congratulating the member for Northampton North for securing this important debate. Impartiality has always been and must remain a crucial underpinning for the BBC. It is right that the BBC is operationally and editorially independent from government, and that impartiality is embedded into its governance at every level. As a result, not only do 8 out of 10 UK adults consume BBC News on average per week, double the next nearest provider, but BBC News is unique in its ability to gain the trust of audiences in the UK, regardless of their political persuasion. Now, as there has been discussed in this debate, and we have heard opinions from across the House and indeed across the country, from East Londonderry, St Austell, Briggangool, Gravesham, Stone and Elmet and Rothwell, I know there are many who are deeply concerned about the impartiality of coverage regarding the terrible events in Israel and Palestine, where over the past few months we have seen an intolerable loss of life and an unacceptable growing humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Indeed, there has been some debate over the way the BBC chooses to use the word terrorist. To be absolutely clear, Hamas are terrorists, and they are prescribed as such in UK law. Hamas have committed brutal atrocities, and I call them a terrorist organisation, as is only right. Now, the BBC are responsible for their own editorial guidelines, and it is not for politicians to tell them what should and shouldn't be included in them. However, I will use the word terrorists, and they will report that I did. Now, in terms of the BBC's coverage on the topic more broadly, I know concerns over impartiality have been raised by people of many different persuasions and backgrounds. Indeed, a poll conducted by More in Common found roughly equal numbers of people find the BBC coverage to be pro-Israel as think it to be pro-Palestine. However, an even larger percentage of 2,000 people polled said they felt the public service broadcasters' output on the conflict between Israel and Hamas had been mostly neutral. Now, this is not to say that the BBC makes no mistakes, and where this happens, they must work swiftly to rectify them. And this is particularly important at a point where community tensions are high. The Community Security Trust, a charity work to eradicate anti-Semitism, have reported a staggering 500% rise in anti-Semitism. And Tell Mama, a project working to address anti-Muslim hatred, have reported over 2,000 Islamophobic incidents between the 7th of October and the 7th of February, more than triple the 600 reported during the same period the year before. We must denounce hate crime in the strongest terms, and I expect to see a robust response to all incidents of hate associated with the conflict. Indeed, I recently met with the Community Security Trust, Stand Up and the Maccabee GB to discuss the worrying rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and the work that is going on in communities to promote tolerance and integration. There is no place in Britain for anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, and all of our media outlets have a duty to report responsibly and accurately on both both the conflict itself and the rise of hatred within this country. With this in mind, it is concerning that Jewish employees at the BBC have raised complaints about their coverage. The BBC say they have well-established and robust processes in place to handle any issues, concerns or complaints. So I would hope and expect this is dealt with fairly and accordingly. I would give way, yes.
So Bill Cash.
The word racist is often used in this context. Actually, much of it is to do with divisions of opinion on matters of religion. And that is very much at the heart of a lot of these problems. And if she does not know it, does she recall that Gandhi himself, when asked what is the most important question about politics or religion, he said, those who do not understand that politics itself is secondary to religion don't know what they're talking about.
For that point, and he certainly put it on the record. I'd like to move on. In terms of the BBC's record on impartiality and their complaints processes more broadly, it is timely that the government's mid-term review has finally been published, as it looked directly at these issues. Indeed, the review noted that the BBC have completed the implementation of their 10-point plan following the Sorota review, with measures including impartiality training for staff, internal content reviews and regular staff surveys on impartiality. Further to this, following the independent review by John Hardy in 2023, the mid-term review also notes that the new social media guidance for BBC presenters that do not cover news, current affairs or factual journalism. The government also found in the review that BBC First delivers fair complaints decisions that withstand scrutiny from the regulator. In terms of improving this further, the review makes a number of recommendations, including increasing external scrutiny of complaints, improving the visibility and clarity of the process, ensuring the quality and timeliness of responses, and giving greater transparency on decision making. It is important that action is taken to work on these, and that Ofcom looks at progress in these areas when it reviews the BBC First before the Charter renewal. Like any institution, the BBC does not get everything right. It is, however, a cornerstone of our creative economy and an important part of our day-to-day lives. The BBC is an important national institution, and we believe we must secure its future as a universal, publicly owned, public service broadcaster, not least in a world where misinformation is rife and public interest journalism is becoming harder to access.
I call Minister Julia Lopez.
Thank you, Ms Vardell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I should very much like to thank my right honourable and learned friend, the member for Northampton North, for securing what is an incredibly important debate on the impartiality of the BBC and the government's role in upholding it. I'm grateful also to every honourable member who has contributed this afternoon, and also to the opposition front benches. I think their contributions have been very constructive, and I very much appreciate it. There were some very important words that were said there in relation to Hamas as a terrorist organisation, and also a clear understanding that the government has taken actions, but that we will keep a lot of these matters under review. I think there is unanimity in this chamber that the BBC is an incredibly important organisation whose integrity we all fundamentally seek to uphold. And I think that is also why we're all here today talking about this issue. There is a collective desire in this House to focus the BBC on its core purpose when it comes to news, to report on the world with a relentless dedication to facts and to truth. For that is the foundation upon which trust is built. And trust, in my opinion, is the BBC's currency in a very complex, ever-changing world where regional events can ricochet with great consequence into the communities and neighbourhoods of the UK. And honourable friends have spoken of this and given examples, and it's something that causes me a great deal of concern, both for my own constituents but also friends that I have who are Jewish and who are Muslim, and who have both received pretty horrifying attacks from the same source, Islamist fundamentalism. And that worries me deeply, and I think none of us in the UK wants to see this play out in our streets. We have a duty to try and lower the heat, but also to have difficult, complex arguments on this issue, and I think this is why we all feel very strongly about the BBC's role in this. We have an implicit social contract which grants the BBC a very unique place in national life, with an equally unique funding structure in the licence fee, because it is bound by duties that commit it to that truth-telling and the reflection of communities in every corner of the UK. And in having a public service broadcaster structured in such a way, we say something very important, I think, about our values as a society, where a commitment to freedom of expression and openness provides an increasingly stark contrast to jurisdictions where the truth is manipulated or suppressed or focused only on the stories of the powerful. And I think you can see that in how conflicts are reported around the world in other countries. Indeed, the first public purpose listed in its Royal Charter requires the BBC to provide duly accurate and impartial news and information. And the impartiality of the BBC goes to the heart, as I say, of the contract between the corporation and all the licence fee payers it serves. The public expects, rightly, for the BBC to be an exemplar of impartiality and accuracy while allowing a range of opinions to be offered and to be debated. But, of course, the BBC is not there as an instrument of government, where ministers seek to interfere with editorial decisions or the day-to-day running of the organisation. That would be, Ms Bardell, in nobody's interest in seeking to build the trust that's so fundamental to its core purpose. Certainly.
Sir Bill Cash.
Would you commit to putting forward the idea that there should be a proper definition along the lines of the Oxford Dictionary, which I mentioned, so that we do have a definition of impartiality in the Charter, as well as the statement that she's just made about it?
Minister.
I'm always happy to engage my honourable friend on these sorts of issues, and we have engaged in relation to the midterm review. I shall look into the particular issue he raises on the definition of impartiality. I suspect that it is written down in some of the documents. It may not be in the Charter itself, but it's something that we talk about to the BBC on a very regular basis. But just to say that, as honourable members will be aware, I tread a fine line here, because I appreciate there may be a desire from colleagues for me to go very far into sticking the boot into the BBC on certain issues, and I want to make sure that I'm always on the right side of that line, because I would not seek to undermine the trust that the BBC has to put at the centre of its compact with the public. But, of course, by the same token, if there are concerns being expressed by citizens of this country and by honourable members on their behalf about how the BBC is carrying out its duties to fair and impartial news, and, of course, in the structures which hold it to account, because for no organisation, particularly one of the BBC's nature, should be exempt from scrutiny. And if large numbers of citizens are questioning the legitimacy of the BBC's funding model as a result, in a way that I fear may risk undermining the future sustainability of the organisation, then I think that requires a response, and that's fundamentally in the interests of the BBC for there to be a response. It requires a response from Ofcom, certainly.
Alex Shelby.
Thank you, Ms Bardell. I'm just grateful for someone from giving way. And I think what fundamentally we come down to something very important in this debate is that you often find the left screaming that the BBC is a Tory mouthpiece and the right screaming that the BBC is a left-wing mouthpiece. That is political opinion and probably says they've roughly got it about right. But there are undisputable facts in terms of the bombing of the hospital and the not checking of verification of sources now that are black and white, and that's where the BBC are taking a wrong turn. That is what is fundamentally undermining the credibility of its impartiality. Not the knockabout politics we have about on particular issues, but these are black and white facts.
Minister.
I think this is the point I'm trying to make, is that we don't seek to interfere with them editorially, but when it comes to a matter where you are risking undermining the trust and faith in the organisation because of the way in which the organisation is being run, then that should be a concern to the BBC, it should be a concern to Ofcom, and it should be a concern to the government, certainly.
Andrew Kersley.
Thank you for giving way. Further to my honourable right on my friend's point, I feel we're being trolled in this debate. Someone has just sent me a picture of 3:39 this afternoon, the banner running alongside BBC News' website. The main banner says, Gaza Health Ministry, 29,878 Palestinians killed. So we're being trolled in this debate. No reference of that being Hamas's figures. No reference of the fact that we know that thousands of those people who have been killed in this are Hamas operatives. The very issues we've raised today. So my honourable friend's absolutely right. There are facts and then there are opinions. And it is a fact that these are Hamas's figures, but they're not being presented as that. In this very debate where we've been calling this out, the BBC is trolling us. They're having a laugh.
Minister.
Well, thank you. And as I say, I'm trying to get the line correct in between giving them editorial independence, but also expressing concerns. Now, in the midterm review, what we have tried to make sure is that there is much greater power for the BBC board to conduct thematic reviews of complaints and to have much more independence from the editorial teams, so that if there is a clear pattern coming through in terms of the nature of the complaints about the BBC's reporting and its editorial decision making, that can be looked into by the BBC, and that is a new innovation that's come from the midterm review. I noticed also that Samir Shah, who is the incoming chairman of the BBC, has also made reference to the idea that there may be an opportunity to review how the BBC is reporting on foreign conflicts to make sure that the corporation is getting it right. And I think, as I say, this goes to the fundamental currency of the BBC, which is that it's a trusted organisation, but with that level of trust comes a much deeper level of responsibility. And other honourable members have talked also about the fact that licence fee payers are paying for this content and therefore rightly expect certain standards to be adhered to. So, as I say, a response is needed not so that we can kick the organisation and its dedicated reporters, but so the BBC can discharge its fundamental duties, and that is to be a beacon of trusted information in an era of water muddying, truth-bending and industrial disinformation. And that's precisely how we worked at the midterm review. Halfway through the Royal Charter, the review was an opportunity to pause, examine and evaluate the effectiveness of the BBC's governance and regulation. The review focused on a range of issues, including editorial standards and impartiality, and our recommendations were unambiguous that there is scope for material improvement across a variety of areas. Now, that review highlighted that impartiality continues to be a major challenge for the BBC. Audience perception that the BBC is not sufficiently impartial is an ongoing issue. Within a culture of continuous improvement, we think that more can be done. Now, following direct and constructive dialogue with us in government, the BBC is implementing major reforms, and perhaps not major enough for my right honourable friend for Stone. But
well, that would be true, but surely an improvement would be if within a few months we could have a test, a review of what's already been done under the new system that's been created, because if that fails, the whole system fails.
Minister.
Well, my right honourable friend and I discussed the midterm review and its findings just before it was launched, and I said to him that there is an opportunity to see how this is playing out, and that will inform some of our discussions about charter review and renewal and the future funding debates that will be had. And I should just point out to honourable members that there is a forthcoming review of the funding model for the BBC, and we will be inviting all honourable members to engage in that review, and it may be an opportunity for my right honourable friends' views to be aired loudly and persistently. Certainly.
Grateful to my friend for highlighting there's going to be a funding review. But I don't feel it's about how the BBC is funded is the issue here. The BBC has built a reputation of being the trusted news source, and it is letting that down. There will be a BBC no matter how it is funded, and people will turn to it. The problem now is that there is a bias being launched against Israel. That is a fact, and the Honourable Lady for Barnsley said that there had been surveys saying that people felt, it was balanced. But they're receiving. They're the ones receiving. They're not the ones involved in it. So I don't think it particularly comes down to how the funding's put in place. I think it's about how we make sure they keep their impartiality.
Minister.
I was referring to the next staging posts that are coming down the line when my right honourable friend suggested that the midterm review was not meaty enough for his tastes. So I was simply encouraging him to engage in the next stages of this conversation. And it is a national conversation that will involve not just honourable members, but the general public. I think it's incredibly important, and it's a concern I've expressed to the Director General, that sometimes we in public life focus on the micro issues in relation to the BBC, and I'm not suggesting for one moment this is one of those, but that we get involved in very regular tussles without asking some very fundamental questions as to what we want the BBC to be going forward. And that's something that I hold very close to my heart, because I think we're entering a very uncertain world where mis and disinformation is being industrialised, and that the BBC has an incredibly important role, and that it's in our interests as a nation and as a Western nation that we try and make sure that its future is safeguarded, that it maintains that public perception of trust and impartiality. And so I simply encourage honourable members in advance of the Charter renewal process, in advance of discussions on the funding fee, that we ask some of those very searching big questions about what we want the BBC truly to be.
In terms of asking questions then, as we're on this topic, perhaps I could ask her, will she ask the BBC, will she write to the Director General to ask him what his actual plan is to deal with the institutionalised anti-Semitism there is in the BBC, that I think he has himself acknowledged in his email to staff? Will she ask him what specific training was given to the anti-Semitic racist apprentice star? Well, I don't call him a star because he's not a star, he's just a nasty little racist. What training was provided to him in specifically anti-Semitic contents, the contents in relation to anti-Semitism, because they won't tell me. And will she ask him if they have an editorial note on anti-Semitism within their newsroom, and if not, will they produce one?
Well, thank you for those very searching questions. I have regular discussions with the Director General, and honourable members regularly talk to me about things that they are concerned about in relation to how the BBC is run. I relay some of those concerns. We have open discussions when he comes to see me and vice versa. As he notes, there has been an email that has gone out to all staff within the BBC in relation to anti-Semitism on those specifics that he asked about in terms of the training for the apprentice candidate that he talked about, and some of the other issues that he raises. I should be happy to discuss those in person with the Director General at our next meeting, if not before. And I have no doubt that there will be somebody from the BBC who will be listening to this debate and also noting what the concerns are that are being expressed in this chamber about the way in which the organisation is run. And I should say it must be very difficult within some of these BBC newsrooms when staff are feeling very concerned about some of the members of staff that have recently come to light in relation to their personal opinions on social media. And I think it again goes back to the fundamental interests of the organisation to make sure that staff can work in those newsrooms and have a drive towards the truth and not fear of intimidation from anybody else in that newsroom. So just to return to the mid-term review, which we worked very hard with the BBC, with Ofcom, to try and tackle some of those fundamental concerns that have been raised about impartiality. And a new legally binding responsibility is now on the BBC board, which will require actively to oversee the BBC's complaints process to assure audiences that their concerns are being fairly considered. And I appreciate that many honourable members in this chamber wanted to move on from the BBC first complaints process, and again that is an issue that will be considered in Charter renewal, and we will also be monitoring closely to see whether there is a substantial change in how complaints are handled as a result of the mid-term review changes. And we also have recommended that Ofcom's regulatory responsibilities will be extended to the online content that the BBC produces. I believe it was referenced in one of the honourable members' contributions, a complaint that Ofcom looked into in relation to how an incident was reported on a bus in Oxford Street where there was anti-Semitism. And that is the kind of complaint, because that was on the BBC's online material, is the kind of complaint that would now be brought into scope because of the mid-term review. But the mid-term review, certainly.
Would my honourable friend be good enough to also take into account the views of Baroness Deitch, KC, who's a crossbencher in the House of Lords, who was a governor of the BBC, who wrote an important letter regarding the judgment of the BBC in the Times newspaper, or was it the Daily Telegraph, it doesn't matter which is extremely interesting. Would you look at it, and would you also speak to Baroness Deitch about it?
Order, before the Minister gets to feet, I have been very generous in giving her extra time to answer all the questions, but I hope she will afford her right honourable colleague the same consideration. Certainly. And allow him to sum up. Minister.
I shall look into that specific issue. But as I say, the mid-term review is a stepping stone by definition. It takes us to Charter review. That will be the time to ask many more fundamental questions of the BBC. I do not wish to take any further time, and I thank him again for tabling this debate.
I thank you, Ms Bardell, and I'm grateful to you and the front bench and back bench colleagues in particular. The BBC is a treasured institution. We care about it and we want it to prosper. That's why we're here but it is failing. And ironically, as has been mentioned by colleagues, today the BBC are heavily pushing what they are calling their Gaza Day. Now, no one begrudges them that. That is what they're entitled to do. But has the BBC done an Israel Day? If you are neutral, if you purport to be neutral, you have to do both. Why not do an Israel Day? If Uruguay and Paraguay were at war and the BBC did a Uruguay Day, I think we would find that they would also do a Paraguay Day. Why not interview the victims, the injured, the Israeli families of the murdered of the pogrom, the hostages that have been released? Why not interview the heroes who saved civilians? If you're purporting to be neutral, you have to do both, and so it's a highly topical example. It is suspicious, of course, because doing such an Israel Day would be an awful lot easier to arrange and perhaps could have been done already. So today the BBC are going some way towards proving the case, but what makes the BBC institutionally anti-Semitic is not that there is bias or anti-Semitism within, and sadly there's a lot of that everywhere. It's the fact that management have not done what they should be doing about it. That's what makes it institutional. BBC employees suffering abuse from within, mistakes not corrected, staff and so-called talent not disciplined, erroneous reports not corrected or pushed out without responsible checking. This has inflamed community tensions. Here in the UK, it's fueled the rise in anti-Semitism. It's harmed diplomatic efforts to end the violence. And to hold oneself out as neutral and to be biased is a form of corruption. The BBC can no longer be permitted to mark their own homework.
Next is considered the government's role in upholding the impartiality of BBC news coverage. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. Can I ask members and others leaving the chamber to do so quietly and respectfully as we're coming on to the next debate? I will call Deirdre